spent most of my career, while you're thinking if you do, as a commercial television news man, like you see on the evening news. I was on ABC News for 19 years. I traveled around the world. I lived in foreign countries, and I covered big developments around the world. I watched communism collapse in one country after another, and ended up with a Polish wife to show for it, who also is a journalist.
Can you tell the group a little bit about what Voice of America is? Because how many of you actually know what Voice of America is?
How many have heard of it? Know what it is? One. No? Voice of America is probably the largest news organization that nobody's ever heard of in the United States. In the rest of the world, everybody knows what it is. It is a US-funded media company founded in 1942 during World War II, which broadcasts in 45 languages and reaches 187 million people a week on every platform known to man. In 1942, it was just shortwave radio. But now it's Facebook, Twitter, satellite TV, 5 or 6 different kinds of radio, websites. You know, you name it. If human beings are inventing it, Voice of America is on it. And as I say, 45 languages. So, and what it does is journalism. It exports. I like to say that what Voice of America does is it exports the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, because it does honest journalism. And it does it in particular to reach, in many cases, countries where there is no freedom of speech, where there is, where the journalists are not free to say what they believe is true, but instead have to say what the government tells them to say. So VOA pops a little free speech into that mix by whatever means it can. And sometimes the government works quite hard in some countries to prevent that message from reaching its people. In China, our messages are jammed. The radio is virtually impossible to listen to. Our websites are blocked. But we get through on satellite television. And people who have illegal dishes, but millions do in China, are able to watch our programming that way. Same goes for Iran. We have a big Farsi service. We broadcast news to Iran that the government doesn't want people to see because it's truthful and balanced, and therefore some aspects of it they don't like because they don't tell their people the truth. But we, as a country, believe it's in our interest for their people to know the truth. Now, what is truth? I mean, everybody's got their own concept of what that means. What I used to say as director of VOA was, we need to be honest about what is newsworthy and important to the audiences we're speaking to, even if it doesn't make our own country look very good. So we are not a propaganda organization at Voice of America. We're a journalism organization, which meant that when there were protests about excessive killings, or any killing is excessive, about killings of black men by police in the United States, and the protests were large, Voice of America needed to cover those and cover the issues behind them and explain the problem and why people are protesting, what was happening. When, what was his name, Snowden, Edward Snowden, who had been a kind of an intelligence officer for the United States in the NSA, the National Security Agency, stole a bunch of documents from the NSA and published them out on the internet, and created a great kerfuffle about how, to the extent to which the United States was spying on people around the world, their communications. We covered that story fully. We didn't hide that story. When there was the scandal about the torture of Iraqi prisoners in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq by American troops, we covered that story fully. So the message that we send by doing that is that Voice of America is an American broadcast, but it's a truthful broadcast. And it covers the United States, even when the stories don't look so good for the United States. By doing that, we build the credibility and the audience size for Voice of America. And that means we have a voice to reach people on all kinds of other topics. So if we're credible to an Iranian audience because we're honest about America, perhaps they might believe us when we have things to say about Iran. Credibility is the coin of the realm in journalism. To be credible, you must be truthful over time. Because if you're untruthful, people will eventually find it out, especially in the digital age when you can Google and check or do something like that.
When you're covering wars particularly.
Well, as I said earlier, I think the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States is the most important part of the Constitution, period. That writing up there on the wall there. That's what our country's basically about. It's based on that, more than anything else. There are various other amendments, there are other values, all good. Maybe I'm biased because I'm a former journalist, but that's what our country's really all about. The ability to speak the truth, to say what you think is the truth, without fear of somebody shooting you for it or throwing you in jail for it. And that freedom brings with it a lot of responsibility when you have the power of the microphone and the camera. You want to use it in a way that benefits the audience. Actually, partly because in the long run they will stop watching you if you don't, but also because I think that the media play a very important part in any democracy. The voters need to be well informed in order to make intelligent decisions. We're, as a country, going to make a decision in a matter of weeks, and it worries me a lot that the race is as close as it is. I guess you can see who I'm for. I'm not Polish, but I have a lot of friends who are. I don't think the media has covered itself in glory in the coverage of this election. I think there are some pretty serious problems with the way the coverage has been conducted. But it's been absolutely essential to a democratic choice. How would we know what the issues are? How would we know what this candidate's stands are without the media to, because we can't all run around and go to every single rally and interview Donald Trump ourselves. So the media gets to the candidates for us and helps us sift through all the information you need as a voter to decide who you're for and who you're against. Terribly important role.
We talk in this class a lot about bias and the importance of unbiased reporting. And in this election, I think we've all seen that even the media has been somewhat biased. Can you talk to that a little bit, what you've seen? And
what I would say is this. Objectivity is a very important goal for journalists. You should always aim for it. And yet there is no such thing as objectivity. You will never get there. It's a goal you shoot at, knowing you will never quite get there. You shoot at it because you want to be, at least the kind of journalist I want to be anyway, wants to give people a chance to make their own minds up, give them the facts with which to make their own judgments, have respect for your audience and allow them to have their opinion, and perhaps disagree with you, but give them the new facts, the news of the day, and allow them to make their own call on what those mean. Increasingly in today's America, we have websites and cable news networks that take one side or another in the political spectrum, and we have a very divided political spectrum now in America, more divided than it's been in probably 100 years or more. So you're having opinion journalism. And of course, opinion has a place in journalism. There's always been an opinion page in the newspapers. And it's fun to read opinion. It's interesting. It's instructive to read copy that is written by someone who's trying to convince you of something, as well as to read copy by someone who's not trying to convince you of a political view, but simply trying to inform. Two different kinds of journalism. Both have their place. I think we have a little too much opinion journalism now and not quite enough straight, honest, fact-finding journalism. But that said, I'm very passionate. I have a passionate point of view. I'm wearing it on my sleeve in this election. You know, I'm very opinionated at this point. I'm not a journalist anymore. I'm working for the Clinton campaign. I'm trying to get her elected, and I can tell you why if you want me to. But that's not probably what you really want me to.
No, if you can, that would be. And how one goes from being a objective journalist to being
Okay,
a
let's-
passionate person who is using that passion now, not in such an unbiased way,
Right.
but in a way to,
I'm openly biased now.
yeah.
Well, most of my life I was a journalist. I was a registered independent. I was not a Democrat, I was not a Republican. It was not appropriate to be either of those, given the job I had to do. And my job was to try to present an objective and, as possible, honest presentation of what was going on in different specters of life that I covered. But when I left journalistic work, I became an ordinary citizen. I am still a registered independent. And I'm politically, personally, I happen to be rather centrist. And the thing I'm most unhappy about is I think the country's moving too far to the left and too far to the right at the same time. I think we need to get here again. That's where I want us to be, and we're those two places. But when we have a choice between a Donald Trump and a Hillary Clinton, and people say, oh, neither of them are good, you know, it's a terrible choice. I'll tell you what, for my money, we have one highly qualified, highly intelligent, highly experienced candidate who's full of flaws. Sure she is. But she's done a lot of good for the country. I've watched her in action. I've worked for her at the State Department. She gets the opinions out of the room if she's having a meeting with very, very effectively. She's always done all of her homework. Then she makes a nice, crisp decision, and she makes sure it's implemented. And that's the kind of leader I want for our country. And I watched Donald Trump. First of all, I can't even tell what he's for and against because he changes it all the time. Secondly, he can't put a coherent paragraph together. He speaks in little jibs and jabs. I think he's a fascist. I think he's a racist. I think he's an idiot. And I think he would be very dangerous.
How do you really feel?
I think he would be very dangerous for our country if he were to lead the country. I think we would lose 100 years or more of progress. He's totally unqualified. I would have, in different circumstances, possibly voted Republican, but not in these.
How do you think his brashness is being looked at outside of the United States? As a former diplomat, as someone who spent a lot of time outside the United States, how do you think he's being perceived, or how do you think this whole election is being perceived?
Well, talking to my friends who are journalists based overseas and reading journalism about how foreigners are perceiving our election, it seems to be pretty widespread view that we've gone out of our minds. Nobody can understand why Donald Trump got as far as he did. So everyone's praying for Hillary Clinton to win. But that said, I don't think people overseas think any more than I do that she's like some fabulous panacea answer to all our problems. No, she's got flaws, she's got problems, she's human. And we're all going to have to pull together as a country if we're going to advance rather than regress. And I actually think we're at a kind of turning point, a rather important moment in history, when I hope our country can pull itself together again, but actually that's an open question. Sadly.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing down here and why you're in Florida? And
Well, I couldn't sleep at night because I was so worried about this election. So I called the Hillary Clinton campaign and said, what can I do? I want to volunteer. And when they looked at my resume and talked to me, they said, okay, we would like you to go down to Florida because it's one of the key states that might decide this election. It's very close, battleground state. And we would like you to organize a statewide voter hotline for people who speak only Spanish or only Creole. There's a hotline in English, which is being run out of Tampa. We're kind of an adjunct of that. But I'm down here in Miami, and I've got a group of terrific Hispanic Americans and Haitian Americans working under my benign oversight. And they're answering calls. And I just came from it, and there's a row of people with phones, and they're answering calls. And the calls can be anything from I can't figure out where to vote, and little simple things like that, to I went to the polling place and they said that Juan Valdez had already voted. And my name's Juan Valdez, but there are lots of Juan Valdezes, and I'm not that guy. And then we want to bring our lawyers in and check whether there's a voter intimidation process at work or not. But we want that person to be able to vote, to exercise their vote, especially if they're a Democrat. So I'm a total partisan now at this point, although I'm still a registered independent. And as I say, what I really want for our country is a good, strong media and two good, strong parties. Part of the reason I want Donald Trump to be crushed is I want a strong Republican Party. And I don't think we can have one if we go down the road that he's leading the Republican Party, where he's trying to divide people by race, by color, by gender, in ways that are, I think, destructive. I want to see someone as the Republican candidate that I can proudly vote for and not be embarrassed by. And if we get back to a situation where that's the case, I'll be a lot happier about the future of our country. So I want to see the Republicans lose badly so that they can do well next time or the time after, whenever they get their act together.
Yeah, you said before that you thought the election was being poorly covered. Like, how would you change it if you were still involved in how would you cover it better?
I think we have to rethink a little bit, those of us who care about it, the way the media is structured in America today. And I'm going to sound like an old fuddy-duddy saying this, but in my day, in the 80s and 90s, when I was a network television correspondent at ABC News, because the networks had to worry about what the Federal Communications Commission would say when their licenses came up, they worked hard to obey something that was then called the Fairness Doctrine, under which they needed to show when their licenses came up that they had done a responsible job of balanced journalism, that they had served the community well, the one that they were serving, whether it was South Florida or the United States. And normally their license would be renewed. But every once in a while the FCC would say, you know what, Mr. Smith, who wants your license? We're going to give it to him. And because that would happen every once in a while, it kind of inspired the license holders to do a good job of trying to have balanced journalism and trying to serve the community with the information it needs. And what voters need right now is information helping them to decide who to vote for. And I think it's very debatable whether the kind of coverage we've seen of this election, with so much focus on Mr. Trump's sex life and Mrs. Clinton's email habits, has been all that useful in figuring out what would he do as president, what would she do as president. There hasn't been the kind of focus on the issues that there should have been. Now, part of the reason for that is because most of the media in America are run on a for-profit basis. And the fact of the matter is that gossip sells, sex sells, scandal sells, and look, it sells me too. I watch all that stuff, don't you? You know, but I guess I would like to see us rethink as a country, how do we want this thing structured? Maybe we need a little bit stronger, maybe PBS should have a stronger role. Maybe there should be a little more funding in the public sector. Because I know that National Public Radio, for example, is a more balanced, frankly, in my opinion, more detailed and careful coverage of the issues than you would see on cable news or some of the more commercial outlets. And I say that as someone who was a commercial journalist most of my life, and I think there's an important role for commercial journalism. I like it. But let's be honest about it. We need to have a mixed kind of journalism in the country where it's not all based on the profit motive. So I'd like to see a little more public sector journalism mixed in there with the for-profit journalism. And I think we'd have a better, more balanced picture.
Come on, wake up. What else do we?
So, like, back to the election, that's like sort of Ava's question, how the media has been covering this. If they focused on more what the candidates would do for as president, how different do you think the polls in the election would turn out compared to focusing on the emails and the sex scandals?
Well, see, if the press was asking, what's your education policy? and then when they got an answer, putting it on the air. Might not be as sexy as the email scandal or the women being groped. But if it was on the air, people would know what it was. What is Donald Trump's education policy? Do you know? I don't. Nobody's ever asked him. So, you know, I'm just saying, the press can drive the agenda to some extent. And that's part of its role. And I think the press in this election has followed rather than led too much. That said, you're not going to not cover some of the stuff that is sort of amazing, crazy stuff that's happened. Of course we're going to cover it. Should cover it. Properly so. But the character of the candidate, which is really what all this stuff that I talked about is about, isn't the only question. There's also, what does this candidate publicly say that he or she is going to do? And so you can then hold them to that later. And there hasn't been enough of that kind of coverage. Would it have changed the outcome? I don't know. I'm a Hillary protagonist, I'm for Hillary, so I would like to argue that yes, it would have. And if people really knew what Hillary, if they understood better, had heard more often in more ways what she's for, as opposed to what Donald Trump's for, had heard from him in more detail, I would like to argue she'd be doing even better than she is. She's ahead, I guess, now, but not by much. She could still lose this election. Could well lose this election if people don't turn out. So I don't know what would happen, but I just think, I hope that I hope some of you are going to become journalists, and I hope that journalism, when you do that, has a bit more of a feeling of public service to it. There's an entertainment side, of course there is, and that's fine. I'm all for that. As I say, I was a commercial television journalist. What's more into entertainment than that? But I also believe we should cover the issues better than has been done this time around, in my opinion. Please.
Speaking of the entertainment side, the debates this time around were certainly memorable and
Yeah.
perhaps not for the best reasons. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you feel the role of the moderator in those debates should be.
I thought that the moderators did well in this election. I don't fault any of them. I think they were all quite good. And I really thought the debates were revealing and fascinating and so important. I would like to have seen a little bit more, along the lines of what I've said, questions on actual policies, what we actually do about. Let me just say a couple things about journalism and about broadcast journalism in particular. What really works is good storytelling. What's compelling on television is people and their stories. And telling those stories well, and telling them in a truthful, carefully researched but compelling way, and letting them tell the story in a way on camera. If you've got a good interview, if you've got a great interview, you've got a great TV piece. Whereas if you've got a great interview, you don't necessarily have a good newspaper piece. That depends,
How would those questions, are there any tips that you can give them for interviewing people so that they get the answers that are going to make those great on-camera moments?
Well, I guess I talked to you not so much about the content of the questions, but about the way in which you ask them. Because on television, it's all about presentation, both by you and by the person you're interviewing. So, to get it, I might ask a brilliant, say I'm interviewing you, I might ask you some really pithy, good question. But if I say, hey, listen, what do you think about something, and I'm kind of not really focused on you, then you may not really focus on me in your answer. And you may not really feel like I care that much about the answer. But if I look at you like this and I say, so tell me, why do you beat your wife? Or whatever the question is. You're going to look back at me and give me some kind of an answer. And it's going to be much more compelling to the camera that's looking at you, to see you looking at somebody just off camera and having this sort of engaged kind of. So you want to, without saying so to the person, you want to engage them. You want to pull them in and bring out the best in them if it's a positive interview, or the worst in them if it's not. But anyway, you want to pull something out of them. You want to get them to emote to you, say something and say it with conviction, whatever it is. Or, if you're trying to embarrass them, you want that to show on their face, and while they're looking at you, and while they can't avoid your steely gaze. You know? So it's, a lot of it is, I'm afraid there's a theatrical aspect to it, if I'm honest with you. But done well, that can work as really compelling journalism. So it's been fun talking to you all. Good luck with journalism. I hope some of you decide on it as a career one day. It's fun. I've had a fantastic ride doing it. And I so strongly believe that in a democracy, good journalism is absolutely critical, because you have to have an informed citizenry, otherwise they can't make good decisions in the voting booth. And without that, democracy doesn't last.